The world is changed. It's not the same world as the 1980s, and yet we behave as if it were. We behave as if the climate was, as if our production capabilities are the same, as if the economy was the same, as if the global political climate was the same. We're not in that world anymore.
In conversations about climate change, generally speaking, we talk and think in the future tense. It's an immense crisis, but it's one ahead of us, albeit quickly arriving. We'll see immense, almost incomprehensible changes over the 21st century, the 22nd century, and centuries thereafter, but we can still do so much about it because it's in the future. Well, today's guest has a slightly different approach. She was recently introduced at the Frankfurt Book Fair as a post-climate change author. Her read on this issue is that it's not in the future, but very much here. In fact, we're decades into this crisis. And her bold assertion in a recently published book is that immigration towards the global north isn't just inevitable, but could also be, relatively speaking, advantageous for all involved. Of course, climate change will mean massive disruption to how we all live, but it need not be chaotic and lead to immense misery and poverty. Broadly speaking, it could work. What if people displaced from sub-Saharan Africa went to Greenland, Canada, Russia? Or what if Inverness became a global megacity filled with industrious young people making the goods and services we all need in the 21st century? It's a startling hypothesis, very interesting, very perhaps controversial, but it's a pragmatic take on a set of issues which we cannot afford to ignore. Gaia Vince, welcome to Downstream.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
We are talking about your book, not so new, 2022 came out.
It's new. It came out in paperback just a few months ago.
There you go. It's very good.
Always relevant.
Yeah, no, well, it's certainly relevant. I mean, it's going to be relevant in 50 years' time. And you can probably glean that from the title, Nomad Century, How to Survive the Climate Upheaval. It has a pretty striking hypothesis in relation to one of the foundations of how we address climate change, which isn't overtly said in many places. We'll come to that. You can probably guess. It's about migration. But before we do, I want to get down to sort of nuts and bolts of climate change, because your background is science, and this is chock-a-block with facts, stats, anecdotes, hundreds. I was like, this just, you could have a Twitter thread which would just be so illuminating with all the stats. So let's start with sea levels, because people love to talk about rising sea levels and climate change. We're looking at about 1 metre this century, perhaps, aren't we?
Yeah, we don't know exactly how high it could go. But the thing about sea levels is it varies in different places for different reasons. For example, if you take the Florida Keys or the Bay, what's happening there is you're getting these kind of like micro seas within the ocean. And so parts of those are rising relative to the erosion on the land much higher than other parts. You're also getting rivers depositing through the deltas, but then washing away other places. In other places, for example, if you look at Scotland, it's still rising after the loss of the glaciers, that weight that really pushed down the land there. So Scotland is rebounding faster than sea level rise.
Wow.
Whereas other places, Bangladesh, for example, stands to lose around 1/3 of its land mass. So it depends where you are around the world. It's not uniform, and it varies, geographically. It can vary really remarkably within quite short distances. But it also depends on things like how much ice loss we're getting from the Greenland ice sheet, from the West Antarctic ice sheet, which at the moment are looking, they are melting at a much faster rate than scientists have modelled for, which is pretty alarming. And there are Earth system tipping points embedded within that. And what I mean by that is that you go from one stable energetic state to a completely different stable energetic state. So you can't make a linear move from one to the other very easily. I compare it to like the straw that broke the donkey's back. So you keep adding that one straw, and eventually the straw that you add takes the donkey's back from one stable state, nice fixed back, to another one, broken back. And you can't withdraw your straw again and the donkey's back returns, right? You've gone to this other energetic state, and it's not impossible that you can return, but it will take a phenomenal amount of energy. It's not just withdrawing a little bit. So we want to avoid those tipping points generally. And that's behind a lot of the attempts to keep below certain temperature rises by the end of the century, and to decarbonise faster and all of that. It's all about keeping away from these tipping points, which are so dangerous to our civilization.
And on the sea levels point, so the atmospheric CO2 that we have right now, which is to say the concentrations of carbon dioxide in the air that we all breathe, is the highest it's been for about several million years. That's correct, isn't it? It's certainly the highest in the history of the human species, so more than 300,000 years.
Absolutely, in the human species. We've never experienced anything like this. And the thing with these greenhouse gases is they're invisible. Right? They're invisible to the wavelength of light that visible light travels in, so we can't see it, but they're opaque to the wavelength of light that heat travels in. So what happens is the sun's heat hits the Earth's surface, and most of it bounces back as heat in a different wavelength of light. It bounces back into outer space. But when we've got all those greenhouse gases, what they're doing is they're trapping that bounce back. They're trapping that energy. And it's this extra energy that's driving these really more violent storms, obviously the heat waves that we see. And that drives things like drought, because it dries the Earth's surface, and hot air holds more moisture. So you can get these much more powerful deluges, these flash floods. And the melt that we see, which is really accelerating.
But on the sea levels point, because I find this really interesting, most people say it's going to be 1 metre, it could be 2 metres, but that's obviously catastrophic. But to most people, they think, okay, 1 or 2 metres, as a civilization, like you say, we can deal with it. But the last time we had the kind of CO2 in the atmosphere that we're looking at now, sea levels were much higher than 1 metre, like significantly higher. Can you explain that disparity? Should we be preparing over, say, several centuries for sea level rises of 50 metres, 100 metres? Or is that just, am I being silly?
Well, so sea levels respond to the heat more slowly. Right, so most of the sea level rise that we have seen over the last century has actually been, when you heat something up, it expands, and that's true for liquids. I mean, it's obviously true for gases, but it's true for liquids as well, because the molecules get more energetic, so they bounce. I don't know how much detail you want.
Please, no, our audience love this stuff.
But they are much more energetic, so that means that they take up more space. So that has been that's what started the sea level rise that we saw initially around the world, and that has now been added to with the sea level rise from melting glaciers. So we're not talking about floating ice, because obviously as that melts, it doesn't do much in terms of changing the sea level rise, because it's it's not on land. But when you melt ice on land, so either mountain glaciers or glaciers on Antarctica, Greenland, and some of these other really thick sheets, you're adding water. So of course, over time, that raises the sea level. And that can have a hugely dramatic effect, huge changes. And we have seen that prehistorically, at points in human experience. When we left the last ice age, the types of warming that we saw after the last ice age were phenomenal. Like, they were visible over a century, quite dramatically. But now we live in this very different world. So, we have these large populations in fixed locations. We're not small populations that easily move. We're in fixed populations where our infrastructure, our capital, our investments, our lives are based around these very vulnerable situations. We live on coasts. Most of our major cities are on coasts or river deltas, for historic reasons, because they were great for trade. So they're much more vulnerable, and it's the sea level rise that you see year on year, and it is visible. There are places in the UK, but there are certainly places that I've been to in Bangladesh, for example, in some of these small island states, where people will point in the water and say, that was my school, that was the town hall. The sea level rise is noticeable. It's really noticeable. But what we're going to see, what we are baking in with some of these rising temperatures are meters of sea level rise, which will occur. We were talking about tipping points earlier, which will occur over the coming centuries. Now, we can deal with that kind of adaptation. It will involve completely moving cities, and cities are moving. The capital of Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, Jakarta, is moving because of this. So it's the sea level rise that you see on the coastline, but that's not the whole story, because as the waters rise, you also get that incursion from underneath, the rise, the fouling of fresh water as the sea gets into the water table, and that of course destroys agriculture, because you can't plant anything there because it's too salty. It means that drinking water supplies are at risk. It means that all sorts of infrastructure is compromised, because you're getting this rise through the pavement or rise through fields of water, this flooding that makes foundations unstable. That's almost as big a problem, in fact, as the rise that you see along the coastline. And then you have to also remember that we have high tides, we have low tides, and different times of the year, monsoonal times and so on. The sea level anyway changes. And when you get a violent storm and the sea level is higher, that is when you have this huge and really terrible effect. When that storm, instead of just being held back by the barriers that we've put in place over centuries, it now can supersede those, and it has that energy, that added energy, which can cause terrible damage to property, to livelihoods, and that can go on. It can go on for years.
So at the 2015 Paris COP, there was all this talk about, obviously, we can't get to 2 degrees warming. Maybe we will. I mean, we obviously will. But there was talk of trying to keep it below 1.5 degrees warming, which is to say that...
Well, not just talk, they agreed.
Yeah.
We have signed up to keep below 2 degrees and do our best to keep below 1.5 by the end of the century, above pre-industrial warming.
Which is say, so average global temperature is 1.5 degrees warmer than whatever the early 19th century, and we can't get there. 1.5 to stay alive. And what I found really interesting in your book is you talk about average rises are already 1.2, but then of course last year, hottest year on record, I think it was 1.48, which shows how quickly things are moving. I mean, this is published in 2022. You have an amazing statistic, actually, and it was in relation to the number of people displaced by climate-related events since the 1980s and the increase to today. One of many great stats in there, but like I say, this is already happening. This is not something in the future. When we use the baseline of 30, 40, 50 years ago, it's quite clear what the trajectory is. Yeah.
I mean, it's so... I did the... opening author speech at the Frankfurt Book Fair this year, which was like a huge privilege. It was really amazing to speak at this time on this subject, because it's so important as we were approaching COP, but also as we're seeing this rise in nationalism across Europe. But I was introduced as the first serious post-climate book. And I thought that's really interesting, because we are in a different world. This is the post-climate change world now. And I don't think people have really understood that. In many people's minds, climate change is still something in the future. It's real now, right? People accept that it's real. It's definitely happening. But I don't think they realise that it has happened, right? We're in that world now. There isn't a going back that's easy. We are now in that world. And yeah, so this really is a pragmatic book of solutions. It's this is where we are right now. Yes, climate migration is underway. Yes, it is inevitable to some extent. And that's something that we need to talk about. We really need to accept. Just as climate change is underway, it is happening. Our world has changed now. It's not a blip. These headlines that come every week, last year certainly, but every month normally, of record-breaking temperature, record-breaking flood, the hottest, the driest, the longest drought, all of these things. This is the world we live in now. It's not a going back.
That's a great formulation, actually. I hadn't thought about that. I have to say, this book for me is one of the most powerful books I've read on climate change, along with David Wallace Wells' Uninhabitable Earth from years ago. But like you say, what's interesting is that with that book, like with your own, it was in no way, it was both optimistic but deeply honest. There wasn't any copium. There wasn't, like, we can do this. It wasn't trying to generate some affect of optimism. There are big problems. We're probably not going to solve a lot of them. Lots of suffering's on its way. How do we mitigate it? And how do we create a better future in a century, frankly? So I like that as a formulation. I just had my first daughter was born last November. So I want to do a bit of a thought experiment with you, because we can talk in abstraction about 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees. She was born in late 2023. She turns 18 in 2041.
Right.
What sort of things might she expect on her 18th birthday? What might we expect to see with regards to these changing climatic patterns?
Yeah, so we are in a dramatically changing world. And the default, weirdly, very weirdly, the default for us as humans, part of our human nature, is to imagine what we have now has firstly always been like that. And then extrapolate that forwards. And I will say that this dramatic shift is not without precedent. If you look back to 1923, what a different world. Okay, so we'd come out of the First World War. The Second World War was 15 years away. We didn't know about the disruption that was going to cause. We didn't even have TV, right? It was that much of a different world. We still had an empire. We still had class divisions that were so rigid that it was very unusual for somebody to imagine themselves in a different role. So if you think what has happened over that century, what has changed, the huge disruption, the huge migrations that occurred, the huge changes, countries that had never existed before, and now appear. Countries have disappeared, new countries have formed, all of that movement, which no one could have imagined. Well, we're in a different position now because we know scientists can model, because of the reassurance and the reliability of physics, we know what the temperature is likely to be and what the repercussions of that in terms of our weather systems and so on are likely to be. In terms of the politics, the geopolitics, that's still very much ours to make. And we shouldn't think that what we have now is the only model, and anything beyond that is crazy and we can't even imagine it, because history shows us that crazy happens all the time. So, if we look at 2041, it's going to be hotter than today. That's an absolute given. We'll be heading towards 2 degrees, almost certainly. And I say almost certainly because there are a few things that could happen. We can talk about artificially cooling the planet, which is a possibility. The technological changes that we have in play at the moment to decarbonise we have all of that. We have all of that, and it's only getting better, and the decarbonisation is underway massively. But, so is our race to continue producing more energy beyond the decarbonised energy. So in terms of our emissions, I don't think that they will come down enough to avoid getting very close, if not passing 2 degrees by the early 2040s. And what that means in Britain, it means there will be the southeastern drought that we're already starting to see will become more prolonged and more severe. Are we building reservoirs to cope with that? I'd say no. We may even start having our first desal plants. We may start increasing reservoir capacity, and things like recycling water within cities will become much more of a priority. Flooding will be much bigger. There will be disappearances already of parts of the kind of Norfolk East Anglia coastline. We're already seeing that. We're seeing huge amounts of erosion there and in other places. Will the government have got a grip on that? Well, I don't see much sign of that now, but we still have, a good 18 years to make a difference, and we could. Air pollution will be much, much improved. When you're doing the school run with your daughter in 5 years, there'll still be air pollution, probably, but in 10 years, so the age of my oldest is 10, I think it will have gone. Most, even large trucks, they will be increasingly electric. So, good and bad.
It's interesting on the electric vehicles because the technology's here. It already makes perfect sense within a market mechanism. Once you've actually bought the thing, it's much cheaper to run. And electricity is price deflationary because of the collapsing costs of wind and solar, blah, 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 blah. More people will have personal solar in their home if they're fortunate enough to be able to buy it, have a drive, you can park your car there, charge it. All sounds great. I live in Portsmouth, which is a very densely populated city. Lots of people don't have drives. And it's been very striking for me to see how little government is building the infrastructure. I don't think a single charging point has been built in the last 12 months, not one. And that's in the context of the government. They've now obviously reneged on this, but this target of we won't sell petrol vehicles after 2030. So it's like on the one level, you've got this rhetoric and you've got the technology and you've got the demand, but it's almost like there's this paralysis to build infrastructure that we take for granted, right? We take pylons for granted, we take roads for granted, we take sewer systems for granted. But it seems like government, states, particularly Britain, but across the West are incapable of doing that.
Yeah, well, some countries are doing a lot better than others. Norway, for example, is doing really well on the electric vehicle infrastructure. But generally, yes. Infrastructure building it's an act of cooperation. It's an act of collaboration with future societies. It's a social enterprise. It's, entirely. It's an act of faith. And it's long term. So when you come together to build new power stations, new energy storage facilities, new transit, even a new tube line, whatever it is, you're putting a lot of money and faith in your society being prosperous into the future, because that's what it brings. That's what infrastructure brings. It's a gift to future generations from today's generation. And what we've had certainly in the last government, has been this chaotic, one leader after another really just chasing their own popularity within their small cabal. We have not had that wider chase of popularity among society. It's been so narrow and so focused that large infrastructure possibilities are ruled out, essentially.
Do you think there's something that relates to our changed conception of time? So there's this great book, I'm sure you've read it, The Good Ancestor,
Right, yeah.
By Roman. We interviewed him on Novara FM last year, maybe the year before.
Okay.
And, he says the optimal way of conceiving of time is to look at your grandparents through to your grandchildren, which is a time frame of around 150 to 200 years. And that is how we should think of time and political action, how to change things, how to do things. Not a news cycle, but equally not 1,000 years, because, that's not very tangible. And I found that really fascinating. And when I think about this country in particular, but also the United States, much of Europe, not all of Europe, but much of Europe, it does feel like we now relate to time in a uniquely strange way. And I wonder where that's come from. Patrick Deneen, who I don't agree with on many things, he's a conservative Catholic philosopher, basically talks about our relationship to time under liberalism and how it's completely warped our idea of time. I'm a socialist, but actually I have a really strong and profound respect for conservative ideas of time, which is to say that not only are you in communion with people horizontally, the people around you, obviously I'd say that I'm a socialist, but also with people in the past and the future. And it does feel that sense of community. And the strangest thing is, the people that most oppose that idea of solidarity and a shared experience over time, over history, are conservatives, are the centre-right. It's a very, very weird moment. They should be the ones championing long-term thinking.
Yeah. I'm not sure how that falls generally in terms of party politics, actually. I think we are in a very unique time, and I think there are different reasons for that. Partly it's things like social media which demand this kind of second-to-second reaction. So instead of getting your news in the morning, in your morning paper or on the wireless, you have to be reactionary every few seconds. And if you're doing that, it is impossible to think more long term. But also, you then get this feedback mechanism where you're chasing these shorter and shorter timelines of popularity. And so you just don't have that mental space to think long term. And many of the crises that we are facing at the moment, for example, the climate crisis, biodiversity crisis, they are long-term problems. They will take time to solve, but their solutions require long-term change. I mean, this is an enormous upheaval this century. And it involves kind of these existential planetary scale threats, disasters, things that are quite often abstract and intangible to your daily life. And it requires making decisions a lot based on trust. And the kind of politics we've had, certainly in the last 10 years, has eroded that trust. The kind of the social media, again, this polarization, these silos that people find themselves in, where they find they're defending kind of, they're not able to take that perspective, that holistic perspective that involves deep time, but also involves a larger community, a planetary community, rather than just your little kind of like-minded buddies. It requires a different framework, a structural framework, which in a lot of ways we've lost. And it's kind of a luxury to have that in many ways as well. In the past, a lot of the people that have had it have either been philosophers, or they've been these rarefied priests or leaders, Romans that wanted to leave a legacy. This concept of legacy, this idea that we take pride in what we leave to future generations because it looks well on us and our family and we feel good about ourselves. That whole concept has been eroded somewhat, I think.
Yeah, quite remarkably, because it's been broadly and ever present for recorded human history. This is interesting because you're saying that we don't have the sort of the framework, the mental conceptions to address these problems because we don't think in the right terms. Is it possible then to think in the right terms, given the way that media ownership works, social media works? It really struck me actually, particularly during the Corbyn leadership. Now he wasn't in the government, but it's the same phenomenon. Also with Trump, the media looked at every single day as almost like an episode of a Netflix series. You know, this is the Corbyn being accosted at home episode where his mother-in-law speaks Spanish and we say he's crazy. This is the Ben Bradley episode where he libels Corbyn and Corbyn, you know, and it was quite obvious to me that even the people working on Corbyn's team, they were viewing the media cycle through that prism because they had to. Oh, we won this episode, we lost that episode. The same with Trump. And it just seems so deeply injurious to addressing the kind of stuff you're talking about, where it's not even necessarily party political. And so, given how media ownership works, billionaires increasingly control the media, from Rupert Murdoch to Jeff Bezos with the Washington Post, to Elon Musk owning Twitter. Given that, how can you be hopeful about us changing course, changing direction, having the kinds of mental conceptions we need, which we'll talk about in a minute in the book, given that the very vehicles for that conversation are so opposed to what you'd want, ideally?
Yeah, I mean, we are in this, pretty horrific space in so many ways. And, again, you can feel mired. You can feel that all of this is impossible, that we are, we're battling these very short news spans. I mean, if you look at the news, it can be very parochial. It can be very soundbitey. And many people don't even look at the news. They're receiving it from, some TikToker, or it's very, very reactionary and very short term. And
Could be me on TikTok. I quite like TikTok. Anyway, go on. I think it's better than most of the stuff on TV.
But it is reactionary, right?
No,
because
I totally
you will
agree.
pick on. There isn't a sort of a pool of people bringing oversight and judgment editorially to what is shown. It's an individual, and the danger with that's absolutely fine if you are, as a viewer, watching a variety of this and receiving a broad kind of overview. That would be actually ideal, maybe better than the other model. But instead, people tend to stick to these very, very narrow viewpoints, and they don't actually see. They've got so many blinkers on, they don't see the bigger picture. So it can feel impossible. But then again, I would say, take the different perspective. Have a look, right? We've come from 2023. We're going somewhere else. We've come from, 1923, the huge changes that were made over that century. I mean, we were just talking about cars. Most of the United States roads were laid down in the 1950s, right? That's within my parents were alive in the 1950s. That's within their lifetime, let alone my grandparents.
Well,
So we can make those changes. The changes that will come can be unimaginable. We can't see them yet. We don't know what they are. But what we have to do is put in place the mechanisms for those things to be possible.
But I think something so strange has happened, again in Britain, that now you see people, they'll campaign against pylons going up near them. And you think, if you had your way 100 years ago, none of this would have happened. We wouldn't have, like I say, sewage systems, water, but nothing would exist. And it does feel that we've come to some sort of, maybe there'll be a catharsis and people realise it's completely idiotic, an idiotic way to run society. But the idea of building anything is just a faux pas. And actually also, by the way, this is on the Green left as well. One of the words I hate the most that comes from Greens is extractivism. Oh, you can't extract things, you can't mine anything. Well, we're going to need to mine something because we need to decarbonise energy systems, and material comes from places. And it's this strange pathology to me that doing anything is somehow damaging the planet, and that actually human action can't be a net positive. And the sad thing is, I do think that's actually come from sort of left-wing and green circles over the last 30, 40 years, and it's been a big mistake. I want to ask you about wet bulb temperatures. Right? Because this is something people talk about all the time.
That's a big swerve.
What does it mean, wet bulb temperatures?
Yeah, so heat is a killer. We know that. It kills tens of thousands of people. When the biggest killer is is humidity plus heat, because, we're mammals, so we need to maintain a certain body temperature. And we do that through evaporative cooling, through sweating. And as that sweat evaporates, it takes the heat energy from our bodies. But if there is too much moisture in the air, our sweat can't evaporate. And so we overheat. And so we measure this wet bulb temperature, how much humidity and heat there is, using something really, really basic. It's called the wet bulb temperature. And it's basically a damp rag around the bulb of a thermometer. And when that rag doesn't cool, the thermometer doesn't change temperature, we've reached the wet bulb temperature. Now, there is this threshold of survivability, the survivability limit, which was thought to be around 35 degrees of a wet bulb temperature. And that had never been exceeded anywhere on Earth until recently, firstly in Oman and then in various other places around the world. And that's the temperature at which a healthy young person who's not physically active will die within 6 hours. Now, there were 2 papers out about a year ago which pushed that wet bulb temperature down, that threshold of survivability limit down, to somewhere between 25 and 28 degrees of a wet bulb temperature, which is very, very worrying. And actually, there have been, if we look back on major deadly heat waves that we've experienced, so there was one in 2003, in Europe, which killed around 30,000 people. There was one in 2010 in Russia that killed around 50,000 people. And in neither of those 2 heat waves did the wet bulb temperature exceed that 28 degrees. So it's very likely that that is the survivability limit. And that's extremely worrying because we exceed that quite frequently in many places. And it's one of the reasons, for example, that labourers in places like Qatar die when they're outside, and these are quite often climate migrants, of course, that have come from their own countries, whether it's Nepal or Bangladesh or wherever, to work there. They're exposed, they're healthy people, they die quite quickly.
So the humidity thing is critical, right? Because obviously humans have lived in conditions of 40 plus, for obviously not for prolonged periods of time, but there are cities where they've been 40 plus, 30, 40 years ago, whatever. But the humidity plus the heat creates a sensation akin to 60, 70 degrees plus.
Yeah, it feels like a lot more. And that heat is a killer. Physiologically, what happens under heat is quite grim, right? The your cell membranes start to disintegrate, decompose. You effectively boil. Your cells start to boil. They denature. You are cooking as a person. So you will die of, kidney failure, or you will die of a heart attack, or various other things. But what is happening is this cooking of your body.
I mean, my father's Iranian, so every summer when it's hot here in July or August, I'll go on various weather apps and I'll look at Basra, Baghdad, Abadan, Persian Gulf. And for weeks on end, 49, 48, 50, 51, for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks.
It's getting terrible there, yeah.
Yeah, and you just think, my God, what if when it gets to the mid-50s, like, humans will not be able to live here, quite obviously.
Yeah. And these are very adapted places to heat because they're culturally adapted. So there are large awnings naturally in the buildings. There are different ventilation systems in the architecture. People are indoors during the hottest periods of the day. They tend to go out in the evenings or early mornings. There's a lot of use of flowing water in the architecture. So they are culturally adapted to hotter temperatures than the temperate north where we live here. But these are extreme conditions now that are happening. And across that area, from Iran to Iraq to, Lebanon, Syria, we've also seen horrific drought, prolonged long-term drought. So this incredible heat, drought, and there is moisture. It's in the air, right, causing that humidity. And that is a huge problem. And we're seeing, instead of once there was a paper out actually really recently in October or November that was showing that since 2010, instead of, once in a century drought and heat, we're now seeing it regularly, as often as once every 5 years or once every 2 years. And people can't recover from that. Instead of it being an unusual event that, people can rally around and they have the resilience to deal with it, when it's constant, when you have this chronic drought, it's really problematic, and it causes agricultural collapse, which pushes up food prices because, cereal crops particularly, they are most sensitive to drought, more than to heat, more than to flooding. Drought is the real killer in terms of agricultural yields. So when you get these chronic droughts, you get poor yields season after season, and that just pushes food. So food availability becomes much more limited, and that pushes the prices up much higher. So ordinary people can't afford bread or rice if it's a rice country. And that, and then they leave rural areas and they go into the cities where there's already conflict because there's just not enough to go around in the cities either. And that's where you get this civil unrest. It's where you get these, it's not the only cause, but climate change is a huge threat multiplier. It adds to all sorts of other problems people are already facing, whether it's conflict. And we see these patterns in conflict, and we see these patterns in migration. There was a really cool paper out actually at the end of last year, which was looking at Mesoamerica, Central America, heat and drought patterns in the growing season, and how that relates to emigration patterns to the United States. And there is an absolute correlation. Like it's amazing. When there's a drought in the growing season, you get this spike in migrants arriving at the border, and when the growing season has, and it's less frequent now, a better season with adequate precipitation, adequate rainfall, you get a reduction.
Latin America is really interesting because obviously you've got the birth rates of a global north region. You've got quite low birth rates. But then you've got the urbanization rates of a global south region. So it's like quite low birth rates, but high rates of urbanization. Like this is very unusual. So clearly, something unusual is catalyzing it. And obviously climate change has a big role to play. And also in Iran, there was a great article recently in the Financial Times about basically the collapse of saffron production.
Right.
And
I didn't read that.
No, really fascinating. Look, this is a luxury good. It's not bread or rice, but
it's very pretty though.
It's very, it's delicious, But what was really interesting for me was this mix of rapid urbanization, climate change, obviously depreciating living standards, a country subject to military economic sanctions. And I thought, look, there's a very real chance this country of 90 million people can become a failed state. Very real, very real. And I don't think European policymakers, politicians have any idea how close we are to a country like Egypt or Iran, 190 million people, becoming a failed state, tens of millions of refugees come to Europe. And we should be trying to stop that for obvious reasons. And it's almost like in the case of Iran, they're trying to accelerate it. And we're not here to talk about geopolitics or anything, but it was the confluence of those factors. And I just thought, it's crazy that the same politicians who back sanctions on a country so dramatically impacted by climate change will be the ones who moan about them moving west, entering Europe.
Climate is absolutely threaded through the whole of geopolitics, and it always has been. When there have been terrible droughts, you have had big migrations. I mean, this is how we're an animal. This is how animals respond. This is how plants respond, right? You can actually see the migration of the tree line. It's moving north.
And it's moving, and we can measure this in terms of like every 0.1 degrees of warming. So give me some numbers on that, because it's fascinating.
Oh, God.
If you can remember. It's all in here.
I can't remember the exact numbers, but it's visible. Like the greening of the Arctic is visible from space. It's really, really noticeable. But we see, so the most obvious ones, of course, are the most mobile animals. So we see fish, insects, butterflies, bees, locusts, mosquitoes, disease-carrying ticks, all of that are moving north at quite a pace. Birds as well, and a lot of pollinator species, they're moving quite rapidly. But even the less mobile animals that are moving. In fact, a lot of the extinctions that we will see as a result of climate change are not actually due to the impacts of that climate change itself. It's due to the fact that the natural migration that could take place is being hindered in some way. And that's just going to be the same for us, right? Because we could move out of harm's way. And if we're not, it's because we have imposed those limits. So for animals and plants, it's habitat loss, it's habitat incursion, with roads and destruction for agriculture or mineral extraction or whatever it is. Preventing that migration to safety. I mean, there are different examples where that's not true. Mountain species can't move any further upslope. They have a limited place to go. Coral reefs, we've passed the tipping points for coral reefs now. There is nowhere for them to go.
And they're very likely to basically disappear by 2050. Oh,
yeah. I mean, many reefs. The year that we've had with the most phenomenal sea surface temperatures recorded, like not just record breaking, but the gap, between anything that has come before and now is absolutely huge. It's caused the decimation, the loss perhaps of Caribbean coral reefs. Those ecosystems can't, they can cope with one bleaching, but this kind of prolonged, chronic, year after year bleaching, they just don't come back. And we're seeing that in, the Great Barrier Reef and various other places.
What's your read on this politically? Because you're obviously very good on the science and the technical details and the facts and the figures. Maybe peerless. It's very good in that respect. But what I found interesting in this book is that it's published in 2022. Clearly, I imagine you were writing and proofreading, etc., during COVID.
Yeah.
And it feels like it's inflected by a certain hope that we won't go back to before. Well, we can't go back. Look what COVID's shown to people, how quickly things can change. In 2020, we have 3 billion animals die in Australia. We have COVID. We have these extreme weather events last year. Are you surprised at how actually we have gone back? Have you been surprised by that since the book's been published, for instance, over the last several years? Actually, people can go back to a default which is really dysfunctional and really bad really quickly.
Yeah, I mean, the default is the easiest because it's known, so it's the easiest place for any of us to be. Change is hard. Change is confronting. So I'm slightly surprised by that. I think if I'm surprised by anything, I'm surprised by our short memories. COVID was a huge trauma. Even if you were not like massively affected, you don't have long COVID, or you didn't have personal friends and relations who died, or any of the other horrific challenges. It was a huge kind of generational trauma that we all went through. There were times when we thought, certainly I thought, would my parents survive? What if this, before we had vaccines, what if we don't get a vaccine? What if this kills my kids? Or, how will we be able to get through this? And we seem to have, as a society, rejected some of the most important lessons that we were taught during COVID, which were that the highest paid jobs are not the jobs of most value, right? Nobody was chasing around, where can I get a hedge fund manager? We wanted delivery drivers, we wanted nurses, we wanted care workers, right? Some of the least well-paid, most appalling, hardworking jobs. They were the most important jobs. And we appreciated that in whatever way. And so quickly, I'm surprised today that in the demands for better conditions from, junior doctors or nurses or whoever it is this week, train drivers, another really, really essential role, that they have almost got defaulted back to their previous demands that, we need more money because it's cost of living, blah, blah, blah. Not, We showed you this was the most important job in society. You cannot live without us. This is a valuable job. We are doing a valuable work in society. We are the most important linchpins that holds this whole artifice together. You must value us. Like, that to me is the strongest argument. And I'm surprised that we don't hear that a lot, because that was a lesson that we were all told so strongly.
The nursing one is incredible, actually, because, I mean, to be fair, I think they've had a better pay settlement than certain parts of the labour market. Obviously, junior doctors are still on strike. But the nurses one is crazy. On average now, a nurse is graduating with about £50,000 worth of debt. The pay isn't particularly good. And like you say, they're so important. And this, again, really comes home to me when my daughter was born. You think these people are invested with so much power, importance, authority.
Literally life and death decisions that they have to make. Yeah. And yet they're in this, systemic culture of decline, of underinvestment, of, part of me thinks, what will it take? We've just had a pandemic where people literally, enormous parts of our society were visibly on the television dying every night. And yet, a year on.
What will it take? Because one of the people that bigs up the book is Kim Stanley Robinson, science fiction writer. And Ministry for the Future, his book.
I'm a huge fan of his. I mean, that was just, I was blown away. I was so...
Great book. Well, he talks at the top of that book about basically the thing that changes this is an extreme weather event in South Asia, India. Millions of people die because we go beyond wet bulb temperatures of, I think he says 35, but let's say it's 28. Millions of people die. They cook to death. And basically, global civil society wakes up to the fact that climate change is here. I mean, that's one read on COVID-19, by the way. We don't have to go down that rabbit hole. So what will it take? Will it take something like that? Will it take millions of people dying before people say, actually, we need to do something?
I don't know. And there are plenty of catastrophists that, green activists or wherever, who come at this with, we need a big disaster where everybody dies to show the world that we need to act. And I absolutely don't go along that. We shouldn't have to need it, obviously. What I will say is we haven't had honesty from leaders. We're not awake. What I wanted to, this book was born out of huge amounts of frustration. I can see what is happening. And this perspective shifting, this need to wake up and be honest about where we really are genuinely with climate breakdown, the choices we genuinely have, because we do still have choices, we need to discuss them, right? We can't live within this complete artificial screen, this world where we imagine that things are exactly the same, but we might have every now and again an extreme event, or the world is changed. It's not the same world as the 1980s, and yet we behave as if it were. We behave as if the climate was, as if our production capabilities are the same, as if the economy was the same, as if the global political climate was the same. We're not in that world anymore. We're in a completely different world. And we need to wake up. We need honesty from the leaders about actually what is happening. The temperature is going up. We are going to face more extreme events. We need to do adaptation literally everywhere around the world. We're not doing it adequately anywhere around the world, particularly in tropical nations, which are becoming unlivable already and which will become more unlivable. Migration, immigration is a fact. It's not, it's not a kind of something that you can say, you can turn around and say, we won't have it, or we're going to put a stop to it, or come up with some absolutely ludicrous idea like this whole Rwanda thing or the barge or whatever the latest nonsense is. Immigration is part of what it means to be human, but at the moment it is actually going to increase, and that is something that is a fact. We can't change that even if we wanted to. So what are we going to do about it? How do we factor that in to our plans for the next century, for our infrastructure, for our housing provision, for our medical health access, our school provision, our road capacity, where we're going to put our industries, how we're going to develop over the next coming decades? It is a fact. We also have this massive demographic decline. People are not having enough babies to support an aging population. In Japan, adult nappies outsell infant ones.
Incredible. I hadn't heard about that until I read the book. Buy the book, because there's hundreds of little things like that. I didn't know that. Crazy.
But
fact.
I mean, in order to maintain today's, a status quo in population, the average woman needs to have 2.1 infants, 2.1 babies, right? The 0.1 is because of, maternal or infant death during that time. So places like South Korea are having something like 1.7 or 1.6.
Not even, right? You mean 0.7?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. I mean, it's absolutely
good,
minuscule.
Yeah.
It's a real, but our economy is predicated on this contract, this social contract that the young working population looks after the aged, the infirm, the disabled population. That is how our society works, right? But and they don't live that long, and then they die, right? But what's happened is they are living much longer. Cancer isn't killing you; you stay alive with with a chronic condition. I mean, we also have this obesity epidemic, which means, and various health problems attached to that, which mean people are living longer but incapacitated earlier, so they're not able to work as long. And we're having fewer and fewer babies to support this social contract. And we want this standard of living, right? It doesn't add up. It will not add up. And the only countries, that are managing to make that population dynamic work are doing it through immigration. I mean, there are various nationalistic countries, from Hungary to Turkey or whatever, that are trying to increase the population by encouraging, Meloni's, I think, also doing it in Italy now.
Even though she has no children, ironically.
Yeah, I think she's, I might be wrong
she has one, sorry. Geert Wilders has no children. She has, I think she has one. And there's this phenomenon of like far right leaders who don't have children, basically, and say you must have children. It's like, well, you first.
So there are, you get a bonus if you have 3 kids, or second kid you get a bonus.
Sorry, she's not married. She does have one.
So child. How disgraceful.
No, I know. Well, these are the people that she rallies against. Yeah, it's bizarre.
I'm also not married, I should say, but this has never ever worked ever. Anywhere.
Is that true?
You cannot, it's true. Nobody has reversed a population decline through policy.
Well, if you look at Hungary, its birth rate right now it's stagnated. So it's about 1.5, 1.6. It's basically been the same for about 20 years, which is below replacement rate. But I think Britain is now 1.5, 1.6. HSBC had a report out recently saying that by the end of the 2030s, we'll be at 1.
No, but we are maintaining. But that's through immigration. We are keeping our population through immigration, not through fertility.
They're saying the total fertility rate of this country would fall to 1 by the end of the 2030s.
Yeah.
And so in that context, 1.5 is quite good. If we could just stabilise at 1.5, so I do think there is an argument.
No,
to say
1.5 is not good if you want to keep any
alongside
production.
immigration. No, of course.
Yeah.
But in the context of your total fertility rate going to 1.5, because obviously the policy target for people that talk in these terms is 2.1. And I think that is probably unrealistic. But I think there clearly should be a political impetus to say, well, we know this from polling. Actually, most people would like larger families. When people are polled on this, they would like 2 children. Cliche, but there we are. The number of Americans who said that 1 was the ideal number of children, I say this as an only child, was 3%. Most Americans would ideally have more children than that. When people were polled on this, they would like more children. They can't have them for quite obvious reasons, economics, career, etc. And I'm not saying people should be compelled to have children. I'm not saying that in the slightest. What I'm saying is that it doesn't seem strange that politicians should say to parents, okay, there is a massive social upside for you to have more children because of the things you're saying, because of aging population, etc. How can we help you? Better maternity care and leave, better housing policies.
Absolutely. I think anybody who wants children, should have as much social assistance as possible to have them. That they are providing a very important job for society. Parents do a really important job for society, but the fact of the matter is that, firstly, urbanisation and women's education and health leads people to have fewer children for a variety of reasons. So that population decline in terms of fertility seems fairly set. I mean, in terms of the hardships that parents are under, that's appalling, and it shouldn't occur. The number of parents visiting food banks, the poor provision in early years and childcare and all of that. It's a complete disgrace. We're not investing at all in the next generation, and we're not making it easy for people who do want children. It's a massive sacrifice. I mean, I know that as a mother, you sacrifice a lot in order. You make choices in life, of course, but you shouldn't have to sacrifice hugely in terms of finance and career in order to have children.
I mean, I find this all quite fascinating because you're right to say, I think we probably agree on this, it's going to be impossible to have a policy prescription to get birth rates 2.1. I agree with you there. But what's interesting, and we're only beginning to see the first glimpses of it in advanced GDP, high GDP advanced economies, is the rise of religious fundamentalism and those people having high birth rates. Israel is a fantastic example. The average liberal Jew in Israel has, I think, 1.5 kids. The average Haredim has 7 or 8 kids. And that's already changing the political complexion of Israel. I mean, you can see that with the far-right governments they elect. In 1948 rather, founding of the State of Israel, 1% of Israelis was Haredim. I think by 2050 it's going to be 1 in 3. Now, you might think, just Israel. In the United States, it's the same with Mormons or evangelicals, much higher birth rates. And there is this theory out there, the religious shall inherit the earth, that because amongst secular liberal-minded people, birth rates are much lower, 1 or 2 kids, and amongst religious fundamentalists, they're much higher, that actually over 4, 5, 6 generations, we see a massive revival of religion. And I increasingly think that's quite likely, actually. I think maybe in we're talking about long time, the long now. I can foresee a world in the 23rd century where they look back at sort of secular liberal 20th, 21st centuries and think like, wow, what the hell were they thinking? I think that's really plausible. When we think of all the futurisms that are available to us, I think a reactionary, regressive, highly religious futurism is actually amongst the
I mean, I can't
various selections.
Obviously I'm not Mystic Meg. I can't look into the future, but I would say that religious fundamentalism is certainly it declines generally when you get more multicultural, more immigration and more multicultural inclusivity in that immigration. So second generation, it's not always, but generally that's what happens. So yes, if you look in small villages in Afghanistan, if you look in these little communities, like the Mormons are exceptional, but there are fundamental religious communities within America. America's a very, very weird place. I mean, it was founded by religious fundamentalists, essentially,
True.
that Europe couldn't bear anymore and sent off.
But
So it does have these really weird sects that persist there. But if you look at, and they, of course, they exist in other places as well, in the Middle East, in parts of Asia, and in Europe. But generally, if you look at cities, urban cities around the world, you have a reduction in fundamentalism. and a reduction generally in religiosity altogether. That may not always continue to be true, but you get more tolerance of other types of religion, other types of lifestyle, other, everything from fashion to sexuality to gender equality. All of that tends to, that sort of tolerance tends to increase. And with that, extremism declines.
See, I think you're probably right, but we could have had the same conversation in the first century AD about Christianity. And I'm fascinated by the demographics around the growth of Christianity. And the frank reality is Christians, for about 2.5 centuries, had much higher birth rates than pagan Romans. And because of their perceived success, higher birth rates, they seem to fare much better during these 2 major plagues which afflict the Roman Empire. This is where the cultural meme of being able to heal the sick was actually a major perception amongst pagan Romans when they were looking at Christians. So I think, look, a tiny sect managed to do that in the context of climate change, major pandemics, geopolitical breakdown. This happened 2,000 years ago. Like, maybe it can happen again. I don't think it's likely, but maybe it can happen again. So who knows?
Well, there is, one of the narratives of the far right is this replacement theory, right? That Muslims are going to come from, brown Muslims are going to come from poor countries into your nice white country and replace them because they have loads and loads of babies. Over the century, we are going to see a darker population of northern populations. I don't think that we will see a massive rise in the birth rate. I don't think that we will see, the types of for a start, the population is anyway declining. There's very few countries now that have where it's normal for mothers to have 6 to 15 kids or whatever. It's very, 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 very few countries.
I think about half
like
the
that
planet
now.
is below 2.1 now, right?
Yeah. So what we're talking about is a general population decline, and population generally across the globe is predicted. It depends on which model you look at, but it could peak as early as the 2050s, and then it could decline by the end of the century to below what we're at the moment, which is 8 billion. So population, global population, which is a huge worry of certain sector of society, is actually something that I don't worry about. I worry much more about this demographic issue of, not getting that right, because we will be desperate for immigrants. We already are desperate for immigrants, right? We don't have people to harvest our crops, to look after our elderly, to, half the bars are closing because they can't get staff, right? And that wasn't just a pandemic thing. That is an ongoing immigration issue. We need immigrants desperately, and what we're going to find is a competition, right, among different countries for the immigrants they want.
Here's the stat from your book, and this is the meat of the book, Nomad Century, because climate change is going to create mass migrations, and we should be comfortable about it, but also see it as part of the solution to the ageing issue. Quote, up to 1.5 billion people will have to leave their homes by 2050. That's very soon, 27 years, according to the International Organization for Migration. And a recent analysis by a different team of scientists pushes the figure up to 3 billion by 2070. So 1.5 billion by 2050, potentially, up to 3 billion by 2070. I mean, we should probably still be alive by 2070, maybe, but certainly 2050. Those 1.5 billion people, where can they go? Or where should they go?
So let me talk about those stats, first of all, because obviously we don't know. And they depend on lots of things. So the stats go, 1.5 billion by 2050, perhaps as few as a few 100 million by 2050, right? We don't know. It depends on lots of things. It depends on the climate, right? How fast we decarbonize. It depends on adaptation. The more we adapt places, the longer people can stay. It depends on funds, right? If we make the world unlivable for people who are too poor to live there, they will need to move. In terms of the 3 billion, actually, by 2070, that's That is a model on the number of people who will be living outside of the human habitability niche by 2070, right? So that's an enormous number of people again. And we do have a lot of adaptive capability. People do live in unlivable places already, but they normally live in small populations, places like Dubai, for example. That's a very, very heavily adapted place. And they live essentially inside a shopping centre. It's air conditioned, it's sealed off from the outside. Everything they need is brought into them. It's a small population of wealthy people. They get their water, their food, their energy, everything comes from outside into them. And that, you know, we have many examples of that around the world where it works. But these large populations, you know, 50 million people in a city like Mumbai, living in slums, you know, living in these tiny little concrete boxes with their corrugated iron roofs, they can't live like that. You know, they're already struggling now. They certainly won't be able to live like that in 2040 or 2050. No, they'll have to move. And that population of Mumbai is still growing, right, because of climate migrants from other rural areas where they're suffering flooding or drought or excessive heat and they can't survive there. So those populations are going to need to move. The question is, will we let them? Will we help them? The safer places to live are in the north. If you look at... I've got a graph in my book, actually, a map, which I asked scientists at the UK Met Office in Exeter to help produce, which looks at multiple impacts of climate change by the end of the century. I did one for 4 degrees and we've got one for 2 degrees as well. And it quite clearly shows this massive zone of unlivability across the tropics. And it extends, you know, up to the Great Lakes in America, all the way down to Patagonia, across, you know, Asia, you know, up into Europe, you know, southern Europe already, south, Spain, Portugal, Greece. You know, they've already lost that Mediterranean climate. They're either on fire or they've got horrific drought or heat. You know, down all the way through the continent of Africa, across Asia, most of Australia. You know, these are very, very heavily populated nations. You know, on a small scale, you know, parts of it will be livable some parts of the year, but we're generally talking about this huge area of unlivability. But then to the north of that, you know, the Arctic, northern Canada, Siberia, Scandinavia, we're looking at areas which, you know, nowhere will escape the negative impacts of climate change, but these are areas that are better able to adapt. They won't experience as severe impacts, as extreme, as frequent impacts. They're able to adapt to what is coming. And that is where people will find safety. So we will need to expand the existing cities there. We will need to build entirely new cities. And when we talk about this migration, this movement of people, you know, people can picture, you know, streams of desperate young men on boats. And there is this connotation built up by this incredibly toxic narrative driven by populist leaders of a threat, of this scary situation. We're not talking about that. We're talking about, you know, not just people, families, but capital, investment, agriculture, skills, expertise, industry. Everything will shift north. And that's a huge opportunity, actually, for those who are lucky enough to, you know, it'll be an upheaval for all of us because we will have to see these changes. These changes are coming anyway. You know, we're already going to see flash floods on the streets that make some towns impossible. We're going to have internal migration anyway. We're going to see, you know, unbearable heat. We're going to have to adapt our buildings. School buildings will have to have air conditioning. You know, I had to take my kids out of school the year before last because it was just too hot in their school. So we're going to have to make these changes, but we also have to prepare and plan for these enlarged populations of people coming from other places, you know. And this is while we're also undergoing this huge upheaval to our energy systems. You know, we need to decarbonize everything.
It makes me think about the immigration question in a really different way. Because I think, look, people know displacement is coming. And like you say, it could be a couple of 100 million, it could be 3 billion, a couple of 100 million is still obviously quite a lot. But the fact you're just taking that for granted, rightly so, and then talking in the kind of quite substantive technical detail was what really, it intrigued me. You talked about charter cities, for instance. You don't seem to support them, but it's one proposal that's out there. And you can see a world where, okay, the United States runs a major deficit. Obviously, has to support an aging population, struggling military-industrial complex. You can see a centre-right politician with a working brain say, okay, well, look, we're going to start 4 or 5 major cities in Alaska. You won't necessarily be citizens. You have a right to work there for 20 years and then revisit it. You won't get pensions, but you'll get whatever various benefits. And that will allow us to fund our deficit for 20 years. And I thought, that's just an obvious... If you're being rationally self-interested, it makes perfect sense.
We need to move that conversation on, right? From where we're mired and stuck at the moment in this ridiculous, non-starter of we're just going to have no immigrants. We're going to push the boats back. We're going to stop people coming. Stop the boats. I mean, what is this nonsense, right? We need to get real. People are coming. How do we make that work?
So we can't stop the boats?
We could stop the boats by providing safe routes for people to come who have a perfectly legitimate, right of asylum here. We're talking about
But a right-winger would say we could stop the boats. It would just be very violent.
Well, I don't think we actually could stop the boats if we didn't provide an alternative. People will come because their need to try is they don't have an alternative. They don't feel they have an alternative. They've already gone through enormous amounts of trauma and keeping people trapped in hostels or centers or basically incarcerated in what is effectively a sort of prison is not the answer, right? We're not getting the best socially or economically out of this young workforce, which it generally is, these new members of our society. We're paying a fortune to keep them in this condition, building up resentment and cross-generational resentment, because children who grow up in refugee camps, are not, they don't feel themselves as members of that society that they want to support and feel patriotic about in any way, I can assure you. So we are building these long-term problems for ourselves when we could be much more pragmatic. We need to start being honest about what we face and having these discussions properly and coming up with, answers to them that actually make sense. We might not agree on all of them, but we have these democratic tools to resolve what we do. And living in denial is not one of them, whether it's about climate change, about, de-carbonising, about migration, about any of this. It's ridiculous, completely ridiculous.
It's interesting, you talk about special economic zones again, not in a particularly fond way, but, it's interesting. You could offer something to the right, say special economic zones, but they're filled with people who are refugees. That would be such a wonderful puzzle for, some people on the right. Look at Scotland, so much land, claims to be, has progressive values, like you say, could build 4 or 5 major town cities in the Highlands, could do all kinds of extraordinary things and fund all kinds of extraordinary things. And you're right to say that that's where the conversation goes. And finally, on this point, there is a lot of land, like so much. Greenland, Canada, Russia, I said Scotland, the Nordic countries, huge amounts of land. Russia and Canada could easily take Alaska, could easily take hundreds of millions, easily.
Yeah. Well, Canada, for example, is planning on trebling its population over the coming decades. It has a much more progressive, and that's very unusual now. But actually, look back 50 years, that's exactly what we were all doing, right? We wanted to have these powerful, productive economies, and so we needed labor. So we were bringing people in. That's what the Windrush was about, The fact that we then treated these new members of our society like shit is neither here nor there. We wanted them in, right? That actually makes a lot more sense than the current nationalistic policy of trying to keep people out when we actually need their labour, we need their taxes. That to me makes very little sense. And I think it will change. It will have to change because reality will hit home soon, that we actually need people. And then, we could be coming up with strategies right now, long-term planning to make it work, because there are no simple solutions, and large numbers of people coming have the potential to, increase the emergence of the far right as it is doing across Europe. And that's really, really frightening. When we talk about the security threat that migrants pose, it's not the migrants that are the security threat, right? That is a labour issue and to some extent a humanitarian issue. The security threat is internal. It comes from the rise of white nationalists in the US, the far right. These terrorist cells, that's the problem. And that needs addressing through smart policy, because at the moment we have this very toxic anti-migrant narrative from our leaders, which is not being challenged with an effective, progressive, pragmatic, sensible narrative. And on top of that, we do not have the policies in place to make this feel like a fair transition. We have lots of left behind communities from post-industrialization who are living in poverty. They have no hope, they have no opportunity, and they see brown people coming into the cities, not even where they live generally, but into cities, and they think, oh, they're getting nice homes, they're getting new jobs, they're doing better than me. And there is, the policies are not in place to address these things.
Final question, because you said about the anti-migrant rhetoric. I mean, that is undeniable. There's a massive rise of anti-migrant rhetoric across the West. But let me put on a hat. I'm now going to put on my Nigel Farage hat. He would say, well, look, actually, Britain's 80% white. We do have large numbers of people from ethnic minority backgrounds. I don't know your heritage. I'm half Iranian. And he would say, well, actually, if you said to Iran 20% of your population should be white European, or if you went to China, you said 20% of your population should be from sub-Saharan Africa, they would say, no, actually, you might not like us. You might think we're demonizing immigrants, but actually, we're the most open, diverse continent in the world. I mean, that's a fair point, isn't it, to an extent that you look at, and they also are afflicted by this issue with regards to demographic aging. China, South Korea, Japan, they refuse, and this will be a problem going forward, of course, for them, they refuse to take people who don't look like them. So are you being a little bit unfair on the European right to an extent?
That's changing.
It's much wider. That's changing. Okay, go on.
That's changing. So yes, there are a number of very xenophobic countries. Perhaps, Japan is one of the most xenophobic countries. It's been easier to gain citizenship as a robot than as a foreigner in Japan, which is, kind of remarkable. And they went a long way down the robot route because they have got this huge problem with not having enough babies. So, they've got robot carers. They pioneered this whole kind of robot artificial workforce. But even they have had to admit defeat, and they've started loosening their immigration requirements for exactly this reason. Russia's exactly the same, massively xenophobic, but one of the fastest depopulating nations on the planet. They are going to have to address it one way or another. And Russia already has, this is even before it started sending all its young people off to get killed in the war. It was already loosening its requirements. So not just from the former Soviet bloc, but from elsewhere, trying to bring people in, especially in the East, to fill these former Soviet cities that are completely depopulated. They've just got a few old people living there. It's a big problem. So everyone's going to have to address this in various ways. And, we are lucky in that Britain, with its very troubled past of doing this because of empire, because of its colonial history, it has already got very multicultural cities, and that's to its advantage. We currently have a prime minister who's brown. We have a foreign secretary. It's hard to keep up with the big changes that constantly happen. A foreign secretary who's brown.
That's Cameron now. It's changed. You're right. But they were brown. Yeah, Cameron's the foreign secretary, right?
Oh, who's James Cleverly then?
James Cleverly is now Home Secretary.
Home Secretary, right? We have the Home Secretary. So yeah, I can't keep up. But we've had preceding ones as well of all different colours, and that's not even particularly remarkable, right? It's not even particularly remarkable, and that's great, because what it means is that your identity as a Brit is not fundamentally first and foremost based on how much melanin you have in your skin, like it is in some states in America, for example, or some towns in the Netherlands, right? It's not based on that. And this is a journey we are all going to have to make as planetary citizens, because people are moving.
Gaia, great place to end on. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.